The theme for the service today is Worldwide Communion Sunday. So the message is going to talk a little bit about communion. So to begin, I'd like to share a reading from the Bible, and this is taken from the Gospel of Matthew. It is the story of the Last Supper. On the first day of the celebration of Passover, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover feast that we will share together?" Jesus said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'Our teacher says, my time is near. I wish to use your home to share the Passover feast with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, Jesus took his place with the 12. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from this, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for you and for many." Amen. Many of you know that story so well, the story of the Last Supper. Let me ask you this. When Jesus gathered with his disciples for that meal, do you think he knew what was coming? Do you think he knew what was going to unfold over the next few days as he would be arrested and then tried and then crucified? If we read the text closely, we have to conclude that he did, in fact, know his end was coming. He said to his friends, "Tell the owner of the house that my time is near." Whether he knew it was as imminent as it was, we don't know. But he clearly knew that dark forces were gathering, that he was a marked man. Of course he knew the end was coming, the end of his movement, and most likely the end of his life. And so he wanted one final feast together with his friends, one final celebration before the end came, hence the Last Supper. What about the disciples? Do you think they knew the end was coming when they gathered for that Last Supper? They too must have known that catastrophe was in the air. They saw the signs. They heard the whispers. They were clearly worried and distressed. And so when they gathered with Jesus in that room to share that last feast, you got to think there was an elephant in the air, or an elephant in the room, that palpable sense of fear and worry and anxiety. And they must have wondered, would Jesus address this? Or would this just be a party, a celebration, a distraction from what was going on? Well, at the risk of overstepping a bit, I tried this week as I was writing this message to put myself in Jesus' position at the Last Supper, knowing what I knew. I wonder how I would have dealt with this palpable sense of worry that was in the room, this fear that hung in the air. What would I have done? I could have ignored it. I could have just set my sights on having a really good time, perhaps for the last time, and figure no one wants to be depressed. This is a feast, a celebration, a party. It was a good distraction from all the stuff going on around us. So I could have ignored it. Or, if somebody had raised it, I could have just dismissed it. Oh, don't worry about the Pharisees and the Romans. They're just blowing smoke. We've got nothing to worry about. I could have tried to put a positive spin on it. Well, you know what they say, it's always darkest before the dawn, or tough times don't last, but tough people do. And just continue with the feast. But I wonder if I would have had the courage to do what Jesus did. To acknowledge the elephant in the room. To acknowledge the brokenness, to name it, and then to actually embrace it. Taking a piece of bread, he said to his disciples, "This is my body broken for you." In other words, he didn't dismiss the brokenness. He didn't avoid it. He didn't explain it away. He didn't bury it beneath sentiment. He wandered right into it. There are lots of reasons that we celebrate communion or celebrate the Last Supper. But at its core is an idea that we are broken people living in a broken world. I know that sounds harsh and heavy, and yet it's also true. And to try to deny that or dismiss it, or to hide it behind a sheen of sentiment, actually robs communion of its real power, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. As one writer put it, the path to wholeness does not go around brokenness, it goes right through it. We are living through some of the most unusual times in history. And not just COVID, which of course is the big one, but there are other cracks in the pavement of humanity that are starting to show. And in some cases, they're actually starting to widen. The Black Lives Matter movement has shone a light on a huge amount of brokenness, particularly among certain peoples in our communities and in our world that's been going on for generations. A great injustice. Environmental unsustainability has us glaring into a future in which depleted resources are being fought over by an overpopulated planet. How about brokenness that's exploited by terror groups or cyber criminals, whose only goal is the unraveling of civilized society? And I could go on. And whether we want to deny it or dismiss it, there is brokenness in the world, just as there was brokenness in Jesus' world. And why is there brokenness in the world? Because the world is filled with broken people. Broken people create broken homes. They create broken lives. They create broken communities. They create broken nations. We're great at putting on a smile, but under the surface we have our cracks and our crevices, our worries and our fears about our health, our families, our stresses at work, our uncertainty for the future. And to top it all off, we have a virus that won't allow us to live the lives that we are used to living. Do we know brokenness as a world? Absolutely. Do we know brokenness as people? Absolutely. We gather at the table of life like those disciples, our hearts heavy with so much, wondering, does Jesus have anything to say to me? The answer is, yes, he does. You know, sometimes as Christians we're challenged to ask ourselves the question, what would Jesus do? Well, if the Last Supper is any indication, we can get a pretty good idea. If we came with him, or came to him, with our brokenness, with our worries, or with our fears, he wouldn't dismiss us. He wouldn't patronize us. He wouldn't say, just think positively and everything will be okay. He would take a piece of bread and break it, and he would encourage us to go through it. In a world where too often we're told to sweep things under the carpet or just forget about something, we forget that often we are at our very best as people when we acknowledge hardship, when we meet its challenges, and when we resolve to journey through them. Human beings are so much stronger, so much more adaptable and resilient than I think we ever give ourselves credit for. We are often at our best when given the opportunity to deal with brokenness, and sadly, often at our worst when we deny it or dismiss it. Let me give you a timely example. I'm sure you heard in the news a couple of weeks ago that in the weeks before the COVID pandemic truly hit, so this would have been back in probably January, we read that Donald Trump had been briefed of the severity of what was coming. And he even acknowledged in a secretly taped conversation that he was worried and that he thought COVID-19 would be one of the great catastrophes of the modern era. Apparently, he knew full well what was coming. But instead of preparing the American public, he chose to dismiss it or put a positive spin on it. It's nothing worse than the flu. It will all be over before we know it. I believe those are pretty much exactly what he said. He said he did that because he didn't want to create panic. But instead, what did he create? Confusion, dissension, which allowed the virus to deepen its hold. By avoiding the true nature of the problem, Trump paved the way for its victory, and instead of equipping people to deal with it, he offered a detour around it. And friends, detours never work. In one article I read, it compared Trump handling COVID-19 to Churchill when he handled World War II. Churchill, on the brink of war, took to the airwaves, told the British people what was to come. He told them that there were difficult times ahead, dark times. It would change their lives. But then he appealed to their resolve, their strength, their willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. And what happened? The people rose to the challenge. We are at our best when we are given the opportunity to go through brokenness rather than around it, to accept it rather than to deny it, and then to deal with it rather than to avoid it. One of the great ironies in life is that we think we always want the easy way. But in fact, easy lives often create complacent people. On the other hand, lives in which challenges are met and overcome are often the most colorful and creative of lives. It is our potholes, not our paved roads, that produce character, integrity, grit, and resolve. And what is true of us is true of our nations as well. Today on Worldwide Communion Sunday, we think about our world for a moment. We think about its brokenness. Do you know what I believe this broken world needs if it even hopes to begin to achieve a tiny bit of Jesus' vision of a world remade along lines of justice, peace, and unity? It needs leaders. Not leaders who will tell us everything is fine. Not leaders who will dismiss our challenges and say, don't worry about it. Not leaders that will take the easy way out, but leaders who will be honest with us. Tell it like it is. Bring the broken places of our communities into the light, and then inspire us, equip us, and encourage us to journey into those broken places and bring our best selves to do the hard work of healing and restoring and rebuilding. We will rise to a challenge when it is put before us, but we need people who have the courage to do that. When people believe in us, we start to believe in ourselves. And when we believe in ourselves, that's the doorway to creative thinking and consistent action. That is what brings real change. And it's exactly the same for each of us. In moments when we worry or fear, when we've been hurt or betrayed or let down, when our spirits have been broken, we don't need to be told, don't worry about it, everything will be fine. We need someone to acknowledge that brokenness, to name that brokenness, and then to remind us that we are stronger than we think, more resilient than we believe, and that we can go through broken times to the light, to the resurrection that is on the other side. The ancient mystic Hildegard always said that humans need two wings to fly. The first wing is the knowledge of evil. The second wing is the knowledge of goodness. In other words, not turning a blind eye or ignoring the brokenness in the world, but also never losing hope to make it better. Keep those two in tension, and that's how we soar. To me, that is what communion is all about. And it is why it is such an important sacrament of our faith, particularly at these times. It is so much more than just a nice gesture or a joyful meal together. It is the acknowledgement of brokenness, but also the elevating of hope. It is finding solidarity in pain, but also mutual encouragement in healing. It is being honest with where we are at, but then pledging again to do whatever we need to do, to be whoever we need to be, to make things as they can be, all in the grace of the one who broke bread and said, "This is for you." There's a famous musical, I've referenced this before, I'm going to end with this, by a guy called Leonard Bernstein. It's called Mass. And in a scene in that musical, there is a scene in that musical that perfectly illustrates what this point is all about. In this scene, there's a priest richly dressed in ornate, magnificent garments. He's lifted up by the crowd while carrying a chalice over his head. Suddenly, the human pyramid collapses, and the priest comes tumbling down. His vestments are ripped off, and the glass chalice falls to the ground and shatters. There's silence. It's a scene of brokenness. Stage goes dark, and then the lights come on again. And the next scene is the priest, slowly walking through the debris of his former glory, barefoot, wearing only a t-shirt and jeans. As he does so, he hears the voices of children singing off stage. They're singing praise, praise, praise. Suddenly the priest looks down. He notices the broken chalice. He looks at it for a long, long time. And then he haltingly says, "I never knew broken glass can shine so brightly." As we now prepare to take communion with Christians around the world as a sign of unity and peace and wholeness, it's a great time to commit again to the encouragement of our faith, to recommit again to a life of resilience, perseverance, and grace. May we be the broken glass through which the light still shines. Amen.